Today, on a special edition of Brian Ross Investigates, Fox News under fire. A court ruling expected any day now on a lawsuit brought against Fox News and its coverage of the pandemic.
Oh, let's bludgeon Trump with this new hoax.
But this is, again, a very narrow issue. Is COVID-19 a hoax? It is certainly not.
The best way to expose falsity is to allow all statements to flourish.
We're joined by the top lawyer for the New York Times, David McCraw, and the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, Aiden McLaughlin, Fox News and the First Amendment. Plus, who's watching the henhouse in the Trump administration? 4 inspectors general now fired by the president. A former inspector general for the Bush administration joins us to warn of the consequence.
This is having a chilling effect, no doubt, on the inspectors general who remain, and it likely will have a chilling effect also on those who might contemplate becoming inspectors general.
And your questions about COVID-19 and the law. Your job, your home, your rights, your wedding.
We really need the funds.
Please tell me where to turn.
From the Law&Crime Network, this is a special COVID-19 edition of Brian Ross Investigates. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our viewers at Facebook Live and YouTube Live. I'm joined today by Rhonda Schwartz, my colleague at Law&Crime and the executive producer of this program. And Rhonda, we expect a ruling sometime later this week from a judge in Washington State, Brian McDonald, in a lawsuit whether it can proceed against Fox News, which is accused of a campaign of deception and dishonesty in its coverage of the pandemic.
That's right, Brian. A small consumer group known as WashLite, it's the Washington League for Increased Transparency and Ethics, brought a lawsuit against Fox News in the state of Washington for giving out misleading information, they say, that could be endangering public health. And they sued as a consumer safety lawsuit. And this is a ruling that we're waiting to hear. The case was heard by Zoom just recently.
Right, it was quite a hearing. The best evidence that this small WashLite group has are some of the on-air clips from Fox News itself, most specifically from Sean Hannity.
All right, so that's the point. I mean, they're scaring the living hell out of people, and I see it again as like, oh, let's bludgeon Trump with this new hoax. Tonight, I can report the sky is absolutely falling. We are all doomed. The end is near. The apocalypse is imminent, and you're going to all die, all of you, in the next 48 hours. And it's all President Trump's fault. Or at least that's what the media mob and the Democratic Extreme Radical Socialist Party would like you to think. They are now sadly politicizing and actually weaponizing an infectious disease in what is basically just the latest effort to bludgeon President Trump.
And joining us now to talk about this case is David McCraw, Deputy General Counsel for the New York Times and the paper's lead newsroom lawyer, and Aiden McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite. And before we get to you, let me play for both of you some of the arguments that were made in court last week in this Zoom hearing, starting with Catherine Clark on behalf of the WashLite watchdog group.
It causes a threat to the public health because people rely on that information and act accordingly. Underlying all of that is an element and of reliability, authenticity, and accurateness. And when it comes to public health, the rules are different. And that you can't lie about. There's no question that many of the Fox News personalities are paid to express their opinions. And I don't have an issue with that. They certainly have that right to do so under whatever their contract is and whatever the relationship and arrangement is between Fox and AT&T and Comcast and Spectrum. But when they start talking about falsehoods that threaten the public health, that is simply not protected speech. And it is appropriately restrained, and I'm not trying to suggest that you should throw prior restraint on its head here, Your Honor, but this is, again, a very narrow issue. Is COVID-19 a hoax? It is certainly not.
The lawyer for Fox News, Michael Carvin, said this was nothing less than a full frontal assault on the First Amendment, and here's how he put it in his argument.
There's a great difference between regulating conduct and regulating speech. The principle underlying the First Amendment is that government cannot prescribe what is orthodox. Having a false statement of fact out there, the plurality and the dissent said, is actually helpful in finding the truth. Because think about it this way. If a court were able, in any conceivable circumstance, to say that someone's opinion about masks or the flu was false, that's only because there's an absolute consensus on the other side. Well, in a circumstance like ours, where you can't read a newspaper or watch a TV without having the consensus view put on you, then the best way to expose falsity is to allow all statements to flourish and expose the falsity. Whereas if a court or the government was to engage in prior restraint and exclude those allegedly false factual statements from the marketplace of ideas, then that would not allow the truth to emerge. That is, of course, particularly true in a circumstance like this, where the notion that there is some infallible truth about the coronavirus that a single court can dictate for the entire nation is utterly illusory. So the notion that a court could step in and freeze, this is the only truth that can be put forth in the marketplace of ideas, would have an extraordinarily detrimental effect and chilling effect. And of course, you not only have to police understatements of the risk of the virus, but overstatements.
David McCraw, let me start with you. Fox News argues it should enjoy the same First Amendment protection for its anchors and hosts and their opinions, as does the New York Times and other print publications. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that, Brian, and thank you for having me. There's no question that truth is important. There's no question we should do something about falsity. The question is what we do about it, and going to court is not the right answer. I think that this is a classic case where we should be covering Fox, just like Fox covers the New York Times. The public should be speaking out on Twitter and elsewhere. The answer really lies with the public to sort through what's true and what's false and respond to falsity with a full voice.
So no other consequence for statements that appear to be quite false.
That's exactly right. And it's one of the hard things I think we all struggle with. For those of us who believe in the First Amendment, the Supreme Court addressed this case, or they addressed this issue in United States versus Alvarez a few years ago. And in that opinion, the court said, do we really need the government to be a ministry of truth? Once you frame it like that, you understand that the issue here is the power of the government, whether that's writing laws that will restrict the press, courts applying those laws. Those are the kind of things that begin to create a problem, and it actually cuts against free expression in the end. And I think it cuts against free expression, it cuts against the truth. We're facing this kind of pressure in Russia. We're facing this kind of pressure in Egypt, where they have fake news laws, and they want to take on the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the other international press. That's just not a path we should go down.
And Aiden, McLaughlin, let me ask you this. Even though there's a strong First Amendment protection for Fox News, the network seems to be taking this quite seriously.
Sure. I mean, I think the network should take any lawsuit like this seriously. I don't think that there's an assumption within the network that this is going to be a lawsuit that's going to cause them much trouble. Despite, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, Gabriel Sherman at Vanity Fair was reporting that within the network, there were fears that their early coverage of the coronavirus would cause legal trouble down the road. The people that I spoke to inside the network were not taking that particularly seriously. The sorts of lawsuits that would cause problems for a media organization, from Mediaite to up to Fox News, would be sort of a defamation lawsuit. Where essentially an organization is trying to determine what's factual, what's opinion, what's news, what falls into sort of approved opinions that Sean Hannity can voice on his cable news show, doesn't seem like something that a lawyer in Washington and a judge in Washington should be outlining for a network like Fox News. So I think when it comes to criticism of the type of coverage that Fox News puts on its airwaves, I think it's much better for media critics and people on social media to challenge what's said on the airwaves at Fox News as opposed to a court.
And David McCraw, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
In their lawsuit, this small group says that they have members who are susceptible to falling ill to the virus and one member who's indeed already ill. They're trying to make the point, doesn't the public health concern outweigh the freedom of speech argument? What do you say about that?
Speech is a powerful, powerful tool. journalism is powerful. And no doubt, just as it can uplift, it can harm. But I don't think we can react to those particular kinds of harm by saying, let's change our whole system. This is a time for speaking out about the coverage that WashLite or any other group thinks is wrong and having that public debate. I know that the plaintiff here is truly well motivated, concerned about public health, concerned about truth. But again, going to court doesn't seem like the right answer. The benefit, I think, that society will get from this is the fact that they have raised these issues and people are talking about it. That's not the same as being in favor of having a court decide that it's going to police a news organization and decide what it can say and what it can't say.
And Aiden, Sean Hannity said he never called it a hoax, although in that clip it clearly he called this hoax. What I was talking about seemed to be a hoax. Have they at all changed their tune because of this lawsuit and other criticism of their coverage and their opinions?
Sure. So it's Sean Hannity's contention that from the beginning of his coverage of this, when he's referring to a hoax, he means that the sort of media coverage, obsessive media coverage of the coronavirus pandemic is a hoax that's being drummed up to bludgeon President Donald Trump. And you saw that in the early days of Fox News' coverage of this pandemic. There was a lot of time spent rejecting calls to shut down the economy and also coverage of the death toll as numbers were rising in the United States, because that was seen as an effort to try and hurt President Donald Trump's popularity. Eventually, they got a lot of criticism for that, particularly in January and February. Their coverage downplaying the coronavirus was met with a pretty strong wave of criticism. And their tune did change. It changed, I'd say, before President Donald Trump's tune did. You know, you look in late March, President Donald Trump was still comparing the coronavirus to the flu. And Fox News, a few weeks before, had sent everyone home to socially distance from home and had shut down their headquarters. So Fox News did change its coverage. I would say it was probably more in response to the heated criticism that they were getting than the threat of this WashLite lawsuit. And Fox News did take a number of steps to try and convey that they were taking this seriously. They fired Trish Regan, who is a Fox Business host, who made some comments that were very similar to Sean Hannity's comments. She, of course, is a lesser-known cable news host and had much lower ratings. So I think they were a little bit more comfortable reprimanding her for those comments. And they also punished two pundits that were on the Fox Nation streaming platform, Diamond and Silk, who floated a bunch of coronavirus conspiracy theories. So there have been some sporadic efforts by management to try and keep the criticism at bay. And also the top hosts on Fox News have sort of changed the way that they're covering this. They cast it less as a hoax now, at least the coverage of it, and are looking more towards sort of reopening up the country and sort of trying to focus more on the economy than the pandemic itself.
And David McCraw, as you know all too well, the Trump administration and the campaign has not been hesitant to sue news organizations itself.
That's right. There has been three, now I guess 4 suits brought by the Trump campaign, the campaign entity, against news organizations. And again, that's why I see this as of a piece, this kind of suit, where people are tempted to go into court to try to resolve their problems with the media, what they disagree with. We were sued during the last election by a Trump supporter who said we were part of a racketeering conspiracy that forced him to have to contribute more to Donald Trump's campaign because of our coverage. I'm thankful to say the courts threw that out. That was the right outcome.
So we're going to see a lot more of this sort of action in courts if this ruling were to go in favor of the WashLite group?
I fear that it opens a door if that's the case. Now, obviously, a trial court decision is not in Washington. It's not likely seen as presidential elsewhere. But if it were affirmed, that would happen. It's just when I understand WashLite trying to say that, hey, I'm just talking about public health and public health is important. But if you look at what's going on in this country, it's almost impossible to sort out the public health component of the pandemic from its economic, cultural ramifications. where do you draw the line? When are you talking about the effect of the shutdown versus public health, or the effect on people's mental health rather than their physical health? All of these things are part of a piece, and I just don't think that's a line that can be drawn no matter how well-intentioned the plaintiffs may be.
All right. Well, a ruling expected later this week, according to Judge Brian McDonald. David McCraw from the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And you too, Aiden McLaughlin from the Mediaite, part of the Law&Crime family. Thanks, both of you, for being here today.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, Ed.
Yep. Coming up, who's watching the White House hen house with 4 inspector generals fired? And your questions about COVID-19 and the law, your rights, your job, your marriage, and your divorce. When we come back, you're watching the Law&Crime Trial Network. Continuing now our report, in the midst of this pandemic, President Trump has decided to fire 4 inspectors general for key departments in his administration, the officials who are supposed to look out for wrongdoing and the misuse of money. President Trump may be legally allowed to do that, but there are questions now about who will be watching the hen house at the White House during this. To get a better understanding of that, I talked with Clark Kent Ervin, a Republican and a former inspector general himself, who aggravated his bosses in the Bush administration. Clark Kent Ervin, thank you so much for joining us. You were an inspector general at the Department of Homeland Security during the Bush administration, and they essentially got rid of you, didn't they?
Well, I was actually never confirmed as Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security. President Bush gave me a recess appointment. The recess appointment expired, and there's no question but that there were a number of hard-hitting reports that I issued as DHS Inspector General, and ultimately I antagonized the administration as a result of that.
Absolutely. I recall covering your efforts back then, and you were very critical of many of the steps being taken to guarantee Homeland Security, and they didn't like them at all. So what's the impact, you think, now with President Trump getting rid of at least 4 inspectors general?
Well, there's no question, Brian, but this is having a chilling effect, no doubt, on the inspectors general who remain, and it likely will have a chilling effect also on those who might contemplate becoming inspectors general. Inspectors general are a unique institution within government. They are inside an agency, but they're inside an administration, but they're supposed to be independent of that agency and independent of the administration. Of course, typically when inspectors general are appointed by a president, they share the political affiliation, the partisan affiliation, the ideological positioning of the president. But once they take that oath of office and assume the job, they're supposed to check their political and partisan affiliations at the door. And they're supposed to undertake such audits and investigations as they think they should, and they're supposed to come to the conclusions that the facts lead them to, even if those conclusions are contrary to the political interests of the administration. So these firings, these demotions, so many of them coming in such quick succession, and it being so clear what the purpose is, it surely will dissuade inspectors general from, as I say, undertaking audits and investigations that are likely to displease the agency head and the administration.
The White House says the president has the absolute right to get rid of any inspector general he wants. And here's how Secretary of State Mike Pompeo put it.
The president has the unilateral right to choose who he wants to be his inspector general at every agency in the federal government. They are presidentially confirmed positions, and those persons, just like all of us, serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. In this case, I recommended to the President that Steve Linnick be terminated. I frankly should have done it some time ago.
So do you agree with that, Clark?
Well, I agree with this, that presidents have the right to nominate inspectors general, and they have the legal right to fire them. But just because one has the legal authority to do that doesn't mean that that should be done. As you know, there is a particular provision in the Inspector General Act of 2008 that requires the president to give Congress 30 days notice before firing inspectors general, 1, and 2, to give reasons for that firing. And that is intended to be a limitation, frankly, on the president's removal power. And it's intended to give presidents pause before doing so, 1, the 30-day period, and 2, it's intended to require them to justify those firings for a good reason. So the statute does not contemplate that inspectors general are like every other political appointee that serves at the pleasure of the president. Unless the inspector general has done something wrong, unless the inspector general has failed to do his or her job, inspectors general are not intended to be fired. And that's why there have been efforts to reform the Inspector General Act further to make it clear that there should be only for-cause removal. There is such a provision in this new HEROES Act that was introduced in the House a week ago or so. A number of members of Congress in both parties are supportive of that. So we'll see if anything comes of that. And I should say in that regard that if anything positive comes from this, in addition to that for-cause removal provision I just mentioned, I hope it will shine a spotlight on just what inspectors general do, who they are, and why they're critical to this accountable system of government that our framers so wisely set up.
You've now seen these 4 inspectors general who are either deputies or full inspectors general removed from their jobs. And these are really important agencies and departments over which they saw what was going on. Lots of money being spent in these agencies, and no longer appears to be an independent inspector general.
Absolutely. And further, there's always a lot of money spent in government, needless to say, but we are in the context, of course, of a pandemic. Unprecedented amounts of money, trillions of dollars, have been injected into the economy, and they've been injected into the economy quickly. So that means that there are massive opportunities, commensurate with the amount of money we're talking about, massive opportunities for waste, fraud, mismanagement, and abuse. And if there's ever been a time when it's critical to have independent and aggressive watchdogs overseeing how that money is spent, making sure that the applicable laws and regulations are being complied with, making sure that there's no conflict of interest in the disbursement and use of that money, it's never been more critical than it is now. I look back at the example of SIGTARP, the Special Inspector General that was set up a decade ago in the aftermath of the Great Recession. That particular watchdog is still going. All these many years later, there was no cutoff on the term of that Inspector General. And there have been hundreds of convictions as a result of this, and a lot of money recovered. It's been a critical institution to hold the government accountable for the massive spending a decade ago. It's even more important, as I say, given the amount of money at issue here, for there to be inspectors general overseeing this.
Let me ask you this. Would you today take an appointment from this administration to be an inspector general in the Trump administration?
Well, that's a good question, Brian. I'm an unusual person in that political pressure doesn't affect me. So I probably would, actually. But the issue is, would most people do that? Would the average person do that? And I do think that, as I say, that it's unlikely in this climate that there will be people who are willing to step forward and step into these very, very sensitive positions. One thing I will note is that over the course of the decades, there has been, commendably, bipartisan support for the institution of inspectors general. Senator Grassley has been a longtime champion of the inspector general community. When I was the inspector general at the State Department, Homeland Security Department, I worked very closely with him, more closely than any other member of Congress, the House or Senate, Democrat or Republican. And I would note that Senator Grassley, Senator Portman, Senator Lankford recently sent a letter to the administration urging the White House to cooperate with inspectors general and to let them do their jobs. And other Republican senators, Senator Romney, Senator Collins, have likewise support for the inspector general community and concern about what's going on recently. So that I hope this will galvanize a bipartisan consensus in support of shoring up the institution of inspectors general so that they can perform this critical watchdog function at this critical time in our country's history.
All right. Clark Kent, Ervin, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Up next, your questions about COVID-19 and the law. Your love, your marriage, your divorce. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network.
When the case first broke, Shanann and Cece and Bella were simply missing.
Like, I have no inclination to where they're at right now.
Something in your gut was telling you that he had something to do with it.
Chris Watts thought that he could go to the police department, knowing the fact that he killed his family.
Why should I believe you? Because I'm a very trustworthy person.
Breeze through a polygraph test.
You intend to answer all of the questions truthfully?
Yes.
Continuing now with your questions about COVID-19 and the law. And Rhonda Schwartz, we're getting lots of questions about love and marriage.
That's right, Brian. It's May. It's the traditional wedding season, May and June, and everybody is wondering about the events that they had put on hold and what's going to happen.
And we're seeing lots of creative solutions to the fact that weddings can't be held with large crowds. Here are some of what we saw around the country this week.
A lot of spring and summer weddings have been postponed or canceled because of COVID-19.
Small wedding businesses are maneuvering to find ways to keep love alive.
Megan and Sulab chose their fairy tale venue, Miller's Castle in Connecticut, after a virtual tour.
We had a FaceTime phone call, my fiance and I. We walked through every piece of the venue.
To help you say yes to the dress, companies including Beholden, Brideside, and Daniel Frankel will ship wedding gown samples for you to try on. And for anyone who doesn't want to wait, you can say a socially distant I do, like the Queen's couple married by their councilman last month, or you can bring your entire family together virtually.
What we do is we take the stress out of it.
The company is now one of a few across the country that helps couples with every step of virtual wedding planning. Modern Rebel deals with everything from digital invitations, virtual video keepsakes and DJs, contactless deliveries of wedding musts like cake and flowers, day of coordination, and even virtual rehearsal dinners.
A celebration box. Tara Federico with Scheme Events fills them with confetti and a USB that includes the wedding ceremony and speeches.
Anything that really represents your wedding that you've been planning for months.
For family and friends who can no longer attend the wedding, but can celebrate from afar.
So this is a gift to say, we love you, we want to include you.
And we're joined now by Heidi Harris from Aronson, Mayefsky, and Sloan, and Steve Hyman from the firm of McLaughlin & Stern. And Heidi, let me start with you, a question from one of our viewers. My son is getting married, or supposed to get married, at the end of August in Minnesota. The venue is expecting him to comply with the contract. If the governor won't allow weddings with more than 200 guests, what are our options?
Well, I'm sorry to say that if you're in a bit of a pickle, if you can't have that kind of a crowd, you're going to have to limit the number of people that are able to attend the event. Everybody's obviously got to comply with the federal guidelines regarding COVID-19, and you may have to, be creative and potentially have, computer screens or something and have a Zoom wedding. It would be surprising to me, though, that a venue would not, offer an alternate date in the future so that they can fill the venue, they can have, keep their reputation. But you're going to have to find some creative way to do it if that's what you're intending on doing.
It looks like it. And Steve Hyman, it raises the larger question of our rights during this pandemic. How many rights do we give up to make sure everyone's health is protected? You've seen some of the stories about whether religion is an essential gathering, whether peaceful protests are an essential gathering. This is a real issue, isn't it, as we sort of go to the slow reopening of the country?
Right. I mean, you are now faced with issues of how you live your life and protect your rights in an area where health is the primary factor that's driving what issues are taking place. I mean, I think that in the end, you're going to have to concede that health is going to drive the issue. But if you are permitting groups to appear for religion, then you have to do it for First Amendment activities such as protest. How that fits in with a wedding, though, is a different issue. That's a real contract issue that, in fact, my firm is involved in one right now. How that's going to play out, I'm not sure. under the contract, whether it's what's called force majeure or whether there are some issues. If the facility can't provide for the number of people they've agreed to take, then I think they have to put the date off at the very least, if not refund the money.
All right. Now, Heidi Harris, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
Heidi, we saw all the creative ways people are trying to move forward with weddings. With the courts closed, what if you want to file for divorce? Is it possible to go forward with that? What's that situation like at the moment?
Today, you can do it. Last week, you couldn't. The courts have just opened this week to allow for the filing of new matters, including divorces. I don't know if I should say I'm happy to say that you can get a divorce now, but you can. This was put on hold for a bit of time. It did raise a couple of questions from a legal standpoint about the potential mischief that one party could do against another one while the person was didn't have the ability to file an action and obtain these automatic orders that we have that keep certain assets in place. But now you can, yes. It's all being done electronically. However, there aren't any court appearances. There is no more personal filings. But yes, it can move ahead now.
And Steve Hyman, you've seen some of the protests going on. People want the country reopened. Who determines what is essential? And is there a challenge if you don't have your act included in the essential acts?
Well, I mean, that's the fundamental question. What is essential? I mean, if the standards are going to be different, if it's of a constitutional nature as compared to a regular business nature. How that is going to be determined by the courts, ultimately, we don't know. But at least essential, I mean, in Vermont, where I am right now, liquor stores are essential. Other businesses were not. How do you make the distinction as to what's essential? If it comes, though, to a fundamental right, such as the right to pray or the right to protest, then you have a constitutional dimension that has to be measured against that of the health issue. And certainly if you permit people to line up to buy groceries, saying they have to be 6 feet apart, but they can do it, or line up even to go into a store for liquor, then you have to, I think, permit the First Amendment rights, both from a prayer point of view and a protest point of view. You have to at least give the opportunity with maybe limiting the number of people and having the social distance in place.
Heidi, another question for you. If bowling alleys and tattoo parlors are considered essential, shouldn't weddings also be called essential?
That's an interesting question. I'm surprised that tattoos and bowling alleys are considered essential. I would think that a wedding might be a little bit more essential for a number of reasons and promotes public policy of people getting married and having families. And it's a funny question, but I can't explain. I'm sorry. Also, another. I'm sorry.
Hey, Brian, you could have. How do you measure essential with a funeral as compared to a wedding? I mean, it brings up the same issue of definition. And I would think a funeral is definitely something that is of a serious, fundamental thing that really can't be put off in the same way that a wedding might be able to.
Right. And Heidi, what is the principal question you're getting from your clients about areas of marriage and divorce?
Well, a lot of people who are currently in the midst of their divorces or have finished up their cases, have signed their agreements, always want to know that. In fact, people want to know this as soon as they come in through the door. How long is it going to take, and when can I get my judgment? And unfortunately, it has also just been announced that it is very unlikely that any divorces are going to be finally granted, judgment stamped, end of summer or possibly even end of year. It's they're saying that if usually it takes about 2 months once the papers are signed for you to get your judgment, it's going to take significantly longer now. And the judges are also warning, don't try to claim that there is an emergency here, that you got to get your divorce signed immediately. It's really not going to work very well.
All right, we're going to continue with more of your questions after a break, including questions about all those gatherings. Are they the right thing to do? Are they putting other people's health at risk? Who has the rights in this case? We'll get to those questions after a break. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network.
When the case first broke, Shanann and Cece and Bella were simply missing.
Like, I have no inclination to where they're at right now.
Something in your gut was telling you that he had something to do with it.
Chris Watts thought that he could go to the police department, knowing the fact that he killed his family.
Why should I believe you? Because I'm a very trustworthy person.
Breeze through a polygraph test.
You intend to answer all of the questions truthfully?
Yes.
We continue now with your questions about COVID-19 and the law. Well, as more and more people have fewer fears in parts of the country about COVID-19 and the warm weather starts to push in, we're seeing more and more cases of people pushing back against limits on social gatherings, often leading to confrontations and arrests.
Flocked to Coney Island today anyway. A lot of masks, but not a whole lot of social distancing.
New Yorkers flocked to city beaches and parks by the thousands. In Central Park, access to the sheep meadow limited. At Hudson River Park, where overcrowding is known to be an issue, cops on patrol, giving out masks. Those laying out, reminded by signs that social distancing is a must.
Multiple NYPD officers who were caught on tape over the weekend violently scuffling with a man and later handcuffing him.
The video starts with a commotion as officers arrested a couple yesterday on 9th Street and Avenue D in the East Village. Suddenly, one of the officers breaks away from that arrest and walks up to a bystander with his taser drawn, swearing and telling him to move back.
The officer tackles him and can be seen slapping and punching him over and over as he's on the ground.
Arrested after she got upset when she was instructed to wear a face mask. Police say the 22-year-old was with her young child at the Atlantic Avenue subway station when cops asked her to put on her mask. They say she refused and responded with profanity.
And so let's go back now to Heidi Harris and Steve Hyman. Steve Hyman, in cases of arrest like that, are they going to hold up in court once this pandemic starts to recede?
Yeah, I think they will, as long as there's a medical necessity. I mean, these are real tough issues. Supreme Court has said you could put somebody in isolation for, smallpox, yellow fever. You can require a vaccination. The requirement of wearing a mask is pretty reasonable compared to putting somebody into an isolation tent, as they did with Casey Hickox in the Ebola case. So I think that can hold up if they're properly implemented and fairly enforced. The problem, of course, is just the number of people can overwhelm a system, and then you've got chaos, which is what can happen, particularly when you have a president that is taking the situation that masks aren't really necessary. So I don't need one, so why do you?
And Heidi Harris, let me ask you, speaking of chaos, with so much closeness now enforced because of the lockdown and the lack of social gatherings, are you seeing more divorces or are people patching things up?
It's a good question. I think everybody originally thought, the phones are going to be ringing off the hook. And then we saw some articles saying, people are going to try and give it another shot. They're stuck together as a family for the good of the children, for the good of themselves and the marriage. I think personally, we're going to stay pretty level. There may be a surge now that we can start new actions. That may have been something that was holding people up. But I'm not sure, when you're all locked together, you really don't have that kind of privacy where you can talk to your lawyer by yourself. It may not be exactly the right time to get started. But I think for sure we're going to keep things level, if not see some bit of an increase.
And just to repeat, you're saying the courts are now open again to, at least in New York, accept divorce actions?
Yes, yes. For a while, they were only accepting motions and conferences in pending cases. You're now allowed to start and initiate a new proceeding.
All right. Steve Hyman, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
We saw a lot of public gatherings over this weekend of all kinds, and one of the big issues also was religious services. What does religious freedom give you the right to gather together in church without masks? Where does that stand?
No, well, you have, it's the same as protest. It's a First Amendment right, so it has to be respected. The problem is the gathering together of people. So there's a balance of the health, which is also a fundamental issue, versus the church right. I think that ultimately they're going to have to come up with a situation where people have a right, if they have a right to congregate at all with certain numbers, they're going to have a right to congregate for church services, but they'll have to, one, either wear masks and maintain social distance. There have been court proceedings already that have found that the right for religion is a fundamental right, and it overruled, I believe, in Kansas, the the governor's order banning complete ban on religious services.
And Steve, what makes sense to you in terms of that? What really makes sense? Here you have liberals, Democrats, the Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, and they don't include in their essential gatherings peaceful protests, for instance.
Well, Cuomo actually changed that. The Civil Liberties Union had a case, and a good friend of mine, Norman Siegel, had a case in which there were the police were permitting people lining up for stores and everything, but if you lined up for a protest, you got a summons and threatened with arrest. Governor Cuomo changed that order, so it does respect now the right to protest, as long as it's limited in number and as long as there's social distancing and, I assume, wearing a mask.
And Heidi Harris, let me get back to you about this question of what's going on in the homes and all the togetherness, whether it's desired or not. Are you also seeing any cases of violence, domestic violence?
I've been fortunate that none of my cases have personally been involved any of that. But yes, there have to be. I know that there was a recent clip that you had shown on an earlier episode of the show where it clearly makes sense that if there is that kind of a dynamic between a survivor and an abuser, that being in close quarters, especially, by the way, if they're in a small apartment in the city or New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and they really don't have the ability to move around very much and get out, there's definitely a potential for heightened acrimony and possibly violence. Absolutely, yes. I mean, people can still call the police, obviously. Essential actions have always included matters involving domestic violence and orders of protection. I can't imagine that it hasn't increased to some extent.
And as you say, there's really a lack of privacy when families are all together. Very quickly, we've got 30 seconds here. What's your best advice to people who are going through some tough times in their marriage?
I think that if you can find some space to have a little bit of alone time, even if it involves walking around the block, properly protected, or just doing something that can clear your head, some activity that can get you away and not always with the same people all the time, I think that does an awful lot to sort of diffuse emotions. And we just have to stick this out. There's really no great alternative, unfortunately.
Right. Absolutely.
And people have isolation.
All right. Well, Heidi Harris, thank you so much. Yep,
thank
absolutely.
You.
Heidi Harris, thank you so much for joining us. Steve Hyman, also, thank you so much. And Rhonda Schwartz, as always, good to have you on the program. Thanks to all of you for watching today. Jesse Weber's here tomorrow. We're back Thursday. And thanks to the Law and Crime team that gets us on the air and off the air.